Welcome to David's Ships. In this video I continue with the construction of the 1 in 350 scale Schwerer Gustav kit. To watch other videos in this build series, follow the link to the playlist in the cards above. Today's video will focus on a number of platforms that need to be installed around the hinges of the gun. Specifically, it is this platform with stairs in it, this platform which leads to a box that sits on the slope, this long walkway that runs underneath the gun. In addition to the platforms that sit around the hinges, I'll install this hand railing that goes on the section of structure underneath the gun platform and the ladder. All of the parts that I'm going to be using during this phase of the build are photo etch parts. That's not really a surprise for this kit since it is a mainly photo etch kit. So as is always the case with photo etch, the first step is to cut them off the sprue and then put on the initial folds. The first parts that I'm going to fold are the ladders. Normally I use a photo etch folding tool to fold step ladders with handrails, but in this case the handrail is only attached to the posts of the ladder at two places, and the posts of the ladders run the full length and are independent from the rails. That means that when bending the handrails up into position, I won't find it easy to move the posts out of alignment with the rungs of the ladder, so everything will stay square. Because of that, there's no need to use the photo etch folding tool, so I take the easy approach of using tweezers. This is the single largest and most complicated piece of photo etch that I'm going to be working with in this video. This is kind of like a staircase, a very large flat staircase with very big steps. The difficulty with this piece is that it needs to align with the resin part on a slope, and the steps need to then set level and parallel to each other. Since these parts go on either side of the gun, they need to be mirror images of each other. They need to be symmetric. So if I make two that look exactly the same, then obviously they won't fit into place because the hand railing will be on the wrong side for one of them. Once again, for this part, there isn't a need to use the photo etch folding tool. It's quite big and the pieces of metal are quite easy to get a grip of. The score lines are quite deep as well, which has been a bit of a double-edged sword in this model. Because while the score lines are quite deep and good, and that makes it easy to bend a part into place, the problem is that if you bend it the wrong way even once, to bend it into the opposite direction to correct the mistake that you've made will instantly cause the part to break off. So you've got to get it right the first time with this kit, otherwise you're going to be gluing everything back together at a later stage. Which is not impossible, it's just a bit frustrating when that happens. To bend this part, I start by bending the edges up into position so I can hold it more easily, and then I use needlepoint tweezers to grip each of the internal platforms and bend them up into position. But unfortunately this part is very delicate and I very easily and quickly break off one of the steps. And as I continue to work with this part, the other parts become more delicate and start to move out of alignment, and this part starts to break apart. This is proving to be quite frustrating. After getting at least the upper piece into a position that I think is reasonable, I glue it in place with super glue, but unfortunately I then continue to work the part a bit too much and cause the bottom step to fall out. So now I've reduced this to only 1 out of 3 steps still in place, and that place is only staying there because it's glued in with super glue at this point. So suffice to say, this has not gone well. So at this point I need to think a bit about how I'm going to proceed. So I'm going to put it on the model first to do a test fit, just to see if this platform that I did get into place is actually positioned correctly. Because if it's at least correctly positioned, then I can work from it. But if it's completely out of position, then I might as well start again with everything. After looking at the parts on the model, I can see that the position of that upper step is fine. But the problem I'm having is that it's incredibly difficult to insert these other platforms into that photo etch structure as folded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it to the side. I'm going to try this again with the undamaged piece of photo etch on the other side of the gun, get it folded into position, and then use that as a guide to reconstruct the other one. This time I fold it in a slightly different way. I start by bending the steps up into the correct position, And then once I have them positioned reasonably well, I fold the sides up into position. I then do a test fit by placing the part on the kit in the location where it will be installed and check to make sure that the steps are parallel to each other and horizontal. Once confirming that the steps are in the correct location, I apply extra thin superglue to the joints from the underneath of the part. Now that I know what this part should look like when it's correctly assembled, I can have another attempt at the part that I have accidentally disassembled. To rebuild this part, I apply extra thick superglue to the edges of the platforms, and then I attempt to insert them into the frame. Fortunately, this is not as easy as it may sound, even with the other part acting as a guide to show me exactly where it should be positioned within the frame. It became apparent quite quickly that trying to install the panels into the frame that was already closed up was going to be very difficult. So I decided that it'd be better to open up the frame and then glue each panel to one of the frames, and then once positioned in the correct location, fold over the other frame and glue the entire part together. After opening up the frame and removing the excess superglue that had been placed from previous attempts, the part is ready for the installation of the panels. Once again, I'm using the correctly completed part as a guide, and I apply extra thick superglue to one end of the panel and then place it into what I understand to be the correct location. I then repeat the process for the middle panel. And while in this state with the part open up, I just try to reposition the parts to make them more parallel to each other. Once generally happy with the state of the panels, I fold up the other frame into position and then apply extra thin superglue to the underneath of the part to glue it in place. That was a bit of a pain, but I got it done, and I think it'll look fine, especially once painted. Once painted, the excess glue that's hidden in certain gaps will be filled in and become much more homogeneous, and a lot of the excess glue is actually underneath the part where it's completely invisible once installed in the model anyway. So I think it'll be fine, as long as everything is reasonably straight. So to move on to the next part, this part has some much thicker metal that needs to be folded. And I find that when you have thick metal and you need to fold quite precisely, it's best to use the Photo-etch folding tool. So I'll pull that out and put on these few bends. Once the larger panels on the side have been folded up, there's a smaller panel on the front that needs to be folded into place. Even though this is quite thick Photo-etch, and that score line in this case is not very deep, because it is so short, tweezers are more than sufficient to fold them into position. And then to complete this box type structure, the back needs to be folded into position and everything can be glued in place. Since the interior of this box will be invisible, I use extra thick superglue to reinforce the corners. In addition to the platforms that are located around the hinges of the gun, I'm also going to be working on some details that sit underneath the gun platform. These details are quite protected because they sit almost inside the model. So it's quite safe to put them on at this stage. Essentially, the way I work is I try and put on the details that are less likely for me to damage first, because they are going to be the ones that have to survive through all the handling of the model all the way until the very end. And then the details that are most exposed, most easy to damage, I try to put on at the very end when there's not much more handling of the kit. These ladders take people from the cabin that is suspended from underneath the gun deck to the gun deck. They are very simple ladders. They don't have hand railings. It's just a flat piece of metal that gets cut straight off of the sprue. All that needs to be done is that it needs to be inserted through the hole in the gun deck all the way down to the lower platform. I found that the best way to install ladders like this is to place extra thick superglue on the edge of the hole in the deck where the ladder will rest against, and then to insert the ladder through the hole at the front of it and let it lean back onto the face where it needs to lie, which has the superglue on it already. That gives you the initial tacking in place of the ladder. It's just enough to hold it where you need it without it falling out. And because it is thick superglue, which is slow drying, there's time to maneuver it into the correct location. Once I have the ladder in the location that I want it, I strengthen the bond with extra thin superglue. A small detail that I should have installed earlier on are these very simple rods. These rods sit on the forward sloping section of the central support structure. As flat pieces of photo etch that lie flat against another flat piece of photo etch, there's very little risk of damaging these parts when handling. So they could have been stuck down earlier, but as I said, they were small parts that I didn't see on the manual when I was building this part of the kit. So I'll just quickly add them on now. The most important thing to get right is that they're oriented in the correct direction and that they are straight. Because of the location of where this rod needs to be placed in the kit is well known, there are small boxes etched into the photo etch to indicate where the ends of that rod must go. Because of that, I can place very small drops of extra thick superglue into those boxes, knowing that they are in the correct location. And then very carefully, I can place the rod in the correct orientation on top of those drops of glue to bond it in place. The next photo etch parts that I'm going to install are some hand railings. These rails are installed on the rear sloping part of the central structure. As with the step ladders, I'm happy to install these parts at this stage because these handrails will be protected underneath the gun platform. In conjunction with the handrails, I need to install a step ladder. These step ladders need to be positioned together with the hand railing. I can't do them one at a time because I need to make sure that there is an appropriate gap between the railing and the ladder, and there isn't a clear location marked onto the kit as to where the ladder should go. So to start, I install the hand railing from the lower portion of the slope. To do this, I apply extra thick superglue to the base of the hand railing. I then touch the feet of the hand railing to the central structure of the gun and then lift the hand railing up into position. Once the lower hand railing is in place, I move on to installing the ladder. I take a very small drop of extra thick superglue and apply a very thin layer to the back of the ladder. The intention is once again to just get it slightly sticky so that I can tack it in place and maneuver it into the correct location. Once I'm happy with its position, I then apply extra thin superglue to the rungs to bond it in place. For parts like this where there's symmetry between either side of the kit, I build them together. So instead of completing one full side in its entirety, I alternate between each side as I install first the lower part of the handrail, then the ladder, then the upper part of the handrail. The process that I follow is the same for either side of the kit. This model should be symmetrical. After installing the ladder, I move on to installing the upper handrail. This proceeds in much the same fashion as the lower handrail, except it is a slightly longer piece, which actually makes it a bit easier because there are more points for it to make contact with the model, and you just get a slightly stronger bond that holds everything in place just that little bit better. Once finishing off on the left side of the kit, I then move on to the right side and repeat the process. I first install the ladder in the correct location by placing it on the model with a very small amount of extra thick superglue to tack it in place. I use extra thin superglue to permanently bond it, and then I install the upper section of the hand railing in the remaining space. Next up is the installation of these step structures that go on the slopes of the hinge. These don't fit onto the resin so well, so they will require a bit of handling to get into position, but it's not like they are so off that it is going to be a problem. To glue them down, I apply extra thick superglue to the resin first and create quite a large surface area for the glue because the glue is going to be concealed underneath this part. I'm not overly concerned about there being a mess in that sense, but I do want any gaps between the slope of the resin and the slope of the photo etch to be filled with extra thick superglue just to conceal that gap. So while I am putting on quite a lot of glue at this stage, it is intentional. And if I do put on too much, there is a large cavity underneath this part for the glue to run into. So it's not all going to squish out of the side and make a whole big mess. Once stuck in place reasonably well with the extra thick superglue, I reinforce the connection points with extra thin superglue. And I end the installation of this part by gluing the final post of this upper section of railing to the resin. The process can then be repeated for the other side. The other side has the problematic piece of photo etch, so this might be a bit more difficult to get right, but let's hope that the lessons learned from installing this first one can be applied to this second side. So far so good. This process is going about as well as I could have hoped. Now just to reinforce these edges with some extra thin super glue, and to end by sticking down this final railing post. That went surprisingly well. With those step-like structures in place, I can now move on to installing these platforms that go at the front of these hinge slopes. These platforms are significantly simpler to install. The only tricky part about them is it's not exactly clear where they should be positioned, because the slope doesn't have any indicated lines as to where they should go, and it's hard to tell if they should be centered or off to one side, or exactly how high or low they should sit on the slope. After looking online for some images of the gun, I was able to find out that the platform should be at the same level as the gun deck, and the whole structure should sit closer towards the inner of the hinge, close towards the gun barrel, rather than towards the outer portion of the hinge. With that information as a guide, I then placed extra thick super glue on the underneath of the part, and then placed it onto the slope into the location where I think it should go. As is almost always the case, I then reinforced the bond with extra thin super glue. The identical process was then repeated for the other side. And now for the final piece of photo etch to be installed in this video. That is this simple walkway that straddles the gun hinges. It was also a bit difficult to find out where this walkway should be positioned on the model, but the short of it is that it should be positioned just above the circular discs molded into the resin. This is one of those parts that can be very complicated to install. It's quite deceptive because it's just a flat piece of metal. How can that possibly be complicated? But the problem is that it needs to straddle two parts of this kit that have to be perfectly symmetrical. And if anything is wrong, even by a fraction of a millimeter, and that gets compounded over distance, then this part is not going to line up. It's going to look skew, and that will make it look very odd. It'll draw your attention to it. So unless everything is perfect, this part won't sit perfectly straight. Now, although this kit isn't perfectly straight, it is straight enough. With a little bit of maneuvering and a small super glue bridge, I was able to get the part into a position where, to the observer, it looks like it is level and straight, like it's squared up with the rest of the model. So that's another bit of relief. I think this is probably the last bit of photo etch that is in this position where it has to straddle both sides of this model. And having this in place and looking acceptable is a huge relief, because I now know that the rest of this model will be able to come together and look reasonable. It won't have something in it that looks obviously off. It also helps that the location where that super glue needed to be built is hidden underneath an upper platform, so you won't even be able to see it. And by a super glue bridge, I'm talking about a fraction of a millimeter. It is very, very, very slightly out of alignment, but it is technically not in contact with the resin. So I did have to build a small super glue bridge, otherwise the walkway wouldn't have been connected on both ends, and that would have made it very weak. It would have just been a prime candidate to get broken off. But fortunately, that bridge is hidden underneath the platform that sits above it, so it won't even be noticeable. With that, we come to the end of this video. In the next video, I'll be building lift cars and finishing up the minor details on the rest of the kit. If you would like to support this channel or see how this model looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.